Hi everyone, my name is Jordan Bell, and today I'll be sharing the progress I've made on my instructional design project. My project is called Creating Visual and Communication Supports for Multilingual Learners Using Technology, and this project was designed as a professional development workshop for K through 12 teachers and paraprofessionals or parapros. The goal of the workshop is to teach educators how to create visual supports using Canva that they can immediately use to do better support with their multilingual learners in their classroom. So I chose this topic because it combines several areas that I'm interested in. My career goal is to become a speech language pathologist, and I will also be graduating in the fall with a background in ESOL. Plus, I do have an interest in assistive technology. And throughout my classes that I've had at UGA, I've learned that many educators are working with multilingual learners, but may not always know the best way to support them. And one thing that's especially important to understand is that language differences related to multilingualism are not the same as language disorders. So instead of focusing on diagnosing students, I wanted this workshop to focus on giving teachers practical tools they can use to make learning more accessible. This workshop is designed for K through 12 teachers and paraprofessionals, as I explained, and is planned to take about 90 to 120 minutes. The overall goal is to teach participants how to create visual classroom directions cards using Canva that they can immediately use with the multilingual learners in their classroom. So throughout the workshop, participants learn how to recognize communication barriers that our multilingual learners may experience. Then they learn how to choose appropriate visual supports, create their own classroom direction cards, and finally discuss how they would implement those supports in their own classroom. And so I wanted the workshop to move from identifying a classroom need to creating a practical solution that the educators can actually use. These are the learning objectives that guide the entire workshop. By the end of the lesson, participants should be able to identify communication barriers, select appropriate visual supports, create classroom direction cards using Canva, and explain how they would use those supports during classroom instruction. I intentionally designed the objectives so they build on one another, and that way the participants first understand the problem, then they learn about the possible solutions, create a resource, and finally explain how they would be able to apply it in their classrooms. Okay, so I'm going to move to Word because I cannot put my table on here. Okay, so this is my plan in more detail. So my workshop follows a more gradual progression so participants can build their own understanding step by step. So I begin with a welcome introductions and an overview of the workshop before leading the whole group discussion about some of the challenges multilingual learners may experience in the classroom. And I wanted to start with discussion because it allows participants to connect to the topic more and their own teaching experiment or experiences. So then next, participants would work together in small groups to analyze classroom scenarios. This gives them an opportunity to identify communication barriers before moving in to selecting the most appropriate visual that supports for each situation. And then after that, I would demonstrate how to create a classroom card using Canva. And once the participants have seen an example, they spend about 30 minutes creating their own classroom direction cards. And um, and then, I intentionally made this the longest activity because I wanted participants to have plenty of time to practice or ask questions and receive feedback if they needed any. And then the workshop ends with participants sharing their completed cards with peers and explaining how they would use them in their own classrooms. And I wanted to finish with reflection and discussion because it gives participants the opportunity to learn from each other's ideas and think about how they can apply these strategies in their own teaching. And then another thing I did focus on throughout this project was making sure every activity directly supports one or more of the learning objectives. I wanted the workshop to move from understanding the problem to creating a practical solution that participants can immediately use in their classroom. I'm going back to Canva. Okay, so would be an example of the main hands-on activity for participants that would be completing or could be completing during the workshop. And obviously, these are very basic vocab words and basic things, and this would be more for a kindergarten level. But obviously, the higher grade level you are, the cards would change depending on what grade level you teach. So the participants will create a visual classroom direction cards using Canva. I chose this activity because it's practical, easy to implement, and gives educators a resource that they could immediately take back to their classrooms. Originally, I did consider having participants create several different types of visual supports, but I realized that would make the workshop way too broad for the time available. So instead, I decided to focus on one activity so participants could have enough time to practice, receive feedback, and leave, with completed resources. And these classroom direction cards provide visual cues alongside classroom directions, which can help multilingual learners better understand classroom expectations and participate more confidently in classroom routines. And then for assessment and evaluation, throughout the workshop, participant understanding is monitored through classroom discussions, scenario analysis, facilitator observations, and the Canva activity itself. So in addition to those assignments, I also created 2 evaluation tools to measure the effectiveness of the workshop. So the first is a participant feedback survey. Participants will provide feedback about the workshop, the activities, the pacing, how confident they felt using the visual sports after completing the lesson. The second is a facilitator reflection form, and that really just allows the instructor to reflect on what worked well, what could be improved, what could be changed, and whether the instructional material successfully supported the learning objectives. And these evaluation tools focus on improving the instructional design itself rather than simply assessing participant learning. And for challenges and feedback, one of the biggest challenges I encountered during this project was narrowing down the scope of the workshop. Because, at first I wanted participants to create several different types of visual supports. As I continued designing the lesson, I realized that trying to cover too much would really just take away from the practice itself and the discussion. So focusing on classroom direction cards made the workshop more realistic for a 90 to 120-minute professional development session. But I would really appreciate feedback on whether that pacing my workshop seems realistic and whether creating classroom direction cards is the most effective activity for meeting the learning objectives. And I'd also appreciate any suggestions for making the workshop more engaging while still keeping it in its practical or still keeping it more practical and useful for educators. Thank you.